Ethan Cole had made a career out of killing legends. At 28, he'd already dismantled 3 haunted houses. One turned out to be a gas leak causing hallucinations, another had a teenager with a sound system in the basement, and the third was just old pipes settling in winter. He'd exposed miracle cures that were rebranded aspirin, ghost sightings that were projection pranks, and weeping statues that leaked from cracked plumbing. The Louisville Courier-Ledger loved him for it. Clean, rational explanations sold papers to readers who wanted their skepticism validated. So when his editor, Marcus Whitfield, slid a thin manila folder across the newsroom desk that Tuesday morning, Ethan barely glanced up from his coffee. "What's this one?" he asked, flipping through 3 printed emails and a handful of grainy cell phone photos. "Let me guess. Another Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Better. A statue they can't move." The photos showed a white marble figure on a hill, arms outstretched, surrounded by what looked like construction equipment. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Can't move or won't move? That's what I want you to find out." Small town called St. Mary's Creek, about 2 hours southeast. Developers tried to relocate a statue for some resort project. 3 attempts, all failed. Now the locals are claiming it's a miracle. Ethan snorted. "Equipment failure, bad ground conditions, maybe some vandalism from locals who don't want change." He closed the folder. "Give me 2 days and I'll have your explanation." "That's what I'm counting on," Marcus said. "Kill the myth, Ethan." "That's your specialty, isn't it?" But as Ethan walked to his car that morning, something nagged at him about the photos. Not the statue itself. Marble figures dotted half the cemeteries in Kentucky. It was the way the townspeople stood around it in the pictures. Not like gawkers at a spectacle, but like mourners at a funeral, or sentries at a post they'd sworn never to abandon. He shook off the feeling and started the engine. 2 days, he told himself. 3 at most. He had no idea he'd still be in St. Mary's Creek 6 weeks later, or that by then, everything he thought he knew about the world would be quietly, irreversibly shattered. The drive to St. Mary's Creek took Ethan through rolling Kentucky farmland that seemed pulled from a postcard. Red barns, split-rail fences, and tobacco fields stretching toward blue-hazed mountains. But as he neared the town, something shifted. The air grew heavier. The light seemed softer, more golden, as if filtered through old glass. He crested a hill and saw it. A white speck on the highest ridge, visible from miles away like a lighthouse in reverse, calling attention to land instead of sea. Even from this distance, he could make out the outstretched arms, the bowed head. The sight gave him an unexpected chill. St. Mary's Creek itself looked like it had been gently forgotten by time. Main Street stretched for maybe 8 blocks, lined with brick storefronts from the 1940s. Some were boarded up, their painted signs faded to whispers. Others still functioned. Tony's Diner, Murphy's Hardware, a grain co-op with a hand-painted sign that read, "Established 1923." People moved slowly here, their eyes automatically drifting toward the hill. Ethan noticed it immediately. Conversations would pause mid-sentence as someone glanced up at the statue, a quick check to make sure she was still there, then resume as if nothing had happened. He parked in front of Tony's Diner, a chrome-sided building that looked like it had been transplanted from a 1950s highway. Inside, red vinyl booths lined the windows, and the air smelled of bacon grease and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. A waitress in her 50s approached with a pot in one hand and a tired smile. "You must be the reporter," she said, not asking. "I'm Carla. Coffee?" Word traveled fast in small towns. "How did you—" "Honey, we get maybe 3 strangers a month here, and they're usually lost." She poured coffee into a heavy white mug. "Plus, Jimmy at the gas station saw you stop to take pictures of the hill. Nobody does that unless they're here about the lady." Ethan pulled out his notebook. "The lady?" "Our Lady, the Blessed Mother, the statue." Carla's voice carried a reverence that made Ethan look up from his notes. "You can write whatever you want about her, but don't make fun. That never ends well." Before he could ask what she meant, the bell above the door chimed and an elderly man in overalls shuffled in. He nodded to Carla, glanced at Ethan's notebook, and took a seat at the counter. That's Frank Dwyer, Kyla said quietly. Owns the auto shop. His grandfather helped carry her up the hill. Ethan spent the morning moving between shops, asking questions, taking notes. Everyone was polite but guarded. At Murphy's Hardware, the owner offered the same warning as Carla. Believe it or don't, son. Just don't mock the lady. At the grain co-op, an old farmer named Pete Patterson leaned against the counter and said, "You want to know why she won't move? Some things just know where they belong." No one tried to convince him of miracles. No one shoved photos in his face or demanded he write about supernatural events. It was as if the entire town had decided their job wasn't to convert him, just to make sure he understood there were boundaries. Lines you didn't cross. That evening, Ethan checked into the Sleepy Inn Motel, the only lodging in town. His room was clean but dated. Wood paneling, a window air conditioner that rattled like dice in a cup, and a view of Rosary Hill framed perfectly in the window. He could see the statue clearly from here, white against the darkening sky, illuminated by some trick of the remaining light. He pulled out his laptop and began typing his initial observations. Small town clinging to folklore. Economic anxiety manifesting as supernatural beliefs. Classic resistance to change disguised as religious fervor. The words came easily, the same patterns he'd seen a dozen times before. But as he wrote, his eyes kept drifting to the window. The statue seemed to glow in the moonlight, and for just a moment he could swear he saw something moving around it. A flicker of white, like fabric catching wind. He grabbed his camera, zoomed in on the hill. Through the telephoto lens, he saw nothing but marble and shadow. But when he reviewed the footage later, frame by frame, there it was again. A brief flash of something pale at the statue's base. It could have been anything. Probably was nothing. Ethan closed the laptop and tried to sleep. But at 3:33 a.m., a sound pulled him from uneasy dreams. Deep and resonant, like a church bell tolling once, slow and mournful. He sat up, listened, but heard only the air conditioner's rattle and the distant murmur of wind through trees. Through the window, Rosary Hill stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, the statue keeping its eternal watch. And for the first time since arriving in St. Mary's Creek, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years of debunking ghost stories and miracle claims. He felt afraid. Martha Grady lived in the last house on Willow Lane, a white clapboard cottage with green shutters and a porch that seemed to sag under the weight of decades. Carla had given Ethan directions over breakfast, along with a warning. "She's 91 and sharp as a tack. Don't try to rush her." Ethan found Martha in a rocking chair on the front porch, wrapped in a blue knitted shawl despite the warm October afternoon. Her eyes were pale but alert, fixed on Rosary Hill visible in the distance. She didn't turn when his footsteps creaked on the porch boards. "You're the reporter," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Cole, Louisville Courier-Ledger." He gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Mind if I sit?" "Course not. Been expecting you." Martha's voice carried the soft drawl of someone who'd lived her entire life in these hills. "You want to know where she came from?" Ethan pulled out his recorder, then hesitated. Something about Martha's stillness made him put it away and reach for his notebook instead. "If you're willing to share." Martha's eyes never left the hill. "It was the winter of '49, she began, her voice low but clear as spring water. "I was 25 then, married to my David for 3 years, living in a little apartment above Murphy's store. We didn't have much in St. Mary's Creek back then. No paved roads, no proper grocery, barely enough souls to fill the church on Sundays. But we had each other, and we had that hill." The rocking chair creaked softly as she swayed. "Folks said it was the highest point in the county. On clear days, you could see the Ohio River glinting 30 miles off, silver like a promise." Ethan found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. Martha had the storyteller's gift, the ability to make the past feel present, urgent. That January, a storm came that should have drowned us all. Martha's hands tightened on her shawl. 3 days of rain that turned to ice, then back to rain. Wind that howled like all the devils in hell were riding it. The river rose fast, too fast. By the second night, we could hear it in the distance, a low rumble like freight trains running all night long. She paused, her breathing shallow with memory. We all knew what was coming. The old-timers remembered the flood of 1913, how it had taken houses, livestock, 3 souls who couldn't get to high ground in time. This storm was bigger, meaner. We packed what we could carry and waited. What happened? Ethan found himself asking, though part of him already knew this wasn't just a weather story. Eileen O'Connell happened. Martha's lips curved into a faint smile. Sweet Irish girl, married to Patrick O'Connell, who'd come back from the Pacific missing 2 fingers on his left hand and carrying nightmares that made him wake up screaming. They had 3 boys, the youngest just 15. The smile faded. That boy, Danny, had been listed missing in action on Okinawa for 4 months. 4 months of not knowing if their baby was alive or dead in some jungle halfway around the world. Then, on the very night the storm hit hardest, a telegram came. Found alive. Coming home. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. Eileen fell to her knees right there in the post office when Marge read her the telegram. Soaked to the bone from the rain, crying like her heart was breaking and mending all at once. And she said something that everyone heard, even over the storm. What did she say? Blessed Mother, if you saved my boy and you saved this town, we'll keep you here forever. Right here, where everyone can see you watching over us. The wind stirred the trees around Martha's porch, and Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. And the storm stopped. Martha's voice was flat, matter of fact. Wind shifted east, water dropped like someone had opened a drain, and by morning you could walk to the edge of town and see exactly where the flood had been heading. Straight for us, before it turned away. Left us high and dry like we were protected by an invisible wall. Ethan scribbled notes, his rational mind already offering explanations. Atmospheric pressure changes, shifting weather patterns, the natural unpredictability of storms. But Martha's certainty unsettled him. That's when the promise became a plan, she continued. No permits, no committees, no architects. Just neighbours with shovels and determination. The marble came from a quarry 2 counties over, damaged goods that a Catholic parish couldn't afford to use for their renovations. They donated it gladly when they heard what we intended. Who carved it? Carlo Mancini. Stone carver from Chicago, out of work and nearly out of hope. He'd carved saints for basilicas, angels for cathedrals, but the Depression had dried up that kind of work. When Patrick O'Connell approached him with our offer, free room and board, whatever food we could spare, but no money, Carlo just nodded. Martha's eyes grew distant. He worked in an open-air shed at the foot of the hill. Locals would bring him coffee, sandwiches, but he barely spoke. Just worked with his chisel and hammer, prayer beads hanging from his belt. Some folks said they could hear him praying in Italian while he carved, though he never confirmed it. How long did it take? 6 weeks, and when she was finished... Martha paused, struggling for words. When you looked at her face, it was like Carlo had found something already there in the marble, just waiting to be uncovered. Peaceful but watchful, loving but strong, like she'd been keeping vigil for centuries, just waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. Ethan looked up from his notes to find Martha watching him intently. You don't believe a word of this, she said. I'm just trying to understand the facts, the timeline, how a statue got carved and placed. Martha shook her head. Those aren't the important parts, son. The important part is what happened when the whole town gathered to see her raised. Tell me, it was just after dawn on a Sunday in April. Clear sky, air so clean you could taste spring coming. Men carried her up the slope in pieces, the robes, the base, the head and arms, like a sacred puzzle being assembled in God's own workshop. Martha's voice grew reverent. Every family brought a stone to place in the foundation, a piece of their land, their hearth, their history. Children carried pebbles, grandmothers brought river rocks worn smooth by time. And when the foundation was laid, Eileen O'Connell knelt down and slipped something into the wet mortar. What was it? A letter, folded small and tied with blue ribbon. She pressed it deep into the foundation stones, then looked up at all of us with tears streaming down her face. Martha's own eyes glistened. She said, "The promise is made. Now it's written in stone." The two sat in silence for a long moment. Down the street, a pickup truck rumbled past, the driver raising two fingers in greeting without slowing. Normal life continuing around this extraordinary story. "What did the letter say?" Ethan finally asked. Martha smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "That took 40 years to find out. Rain and time wore the mortar thin enough that one summer day I could see the edge of something pale poking through. I was in my 70s by then, but I brushed away the dirt with these old hands." She held up fingers gnarled by arthritis, but still steady. "The paper was still there, still folded, still intact. We didn't open it right away, didn't feel right, but Eileen was in her final days by then, and she asked for it. And one sentence, in Eileen's careful handwriting, 'If you save our town, we will keep you here forever.'" Martha leaned forward in her chair. "That letter is still there, son, right where she put it. You can't see it now, but you don't have to. The lady remembers." A cloud passed over the sun, casting the porch in shadow. Ethan found himself looking toward Rosary Hill, where the white marble figure stood against the darkening sky. "You came here looking for a story you could explain," Martha said quietly. "But this one isn't about explanations. It's about a promise. And promises like that, they don't break easy." As Ethan walked back to his car, Martha's words echoed in his mind. He'd gotten the background he needed, the human interest angle that would frame his debunking piece. But something about the old woman's certainty, the way she spoke about the statue as if it were a living thing, left him unsettled. That evening, he climbed Rosary Hill for the first time. The path up Rosary Hill was worn smooth by 70 years of pilgrims' feet. It wound through maple and oak trees just beginning to turn autumn colors, their leaves rustling overhead like whispered conversations. Ethan climbed slowly, his city lungs working harder than expected in the crisp October air. He'd brought his camera, voice recorder, and a skeptic's determination to find the mundane truth behind St. Mary's Creek's miracle. What he found when he reached the summit was more unsettling than any supernatural claim. The statue stood 8 feet tall, carved from white marble that seemed to gather and hold the last light of day. Her robes flowed in stone folds so realistic that Ethan half expected them to ripple in the evening breeze. Her face was turned downward, eyes closed, expression serene yet somehow watchful. Her arms stretched wide in welcome or benediction, or warning. But it wasn't the statue that made Ethan's breath catch. It was the foundation. He knelt and ran his hands over the base, feeling for tool marks, examining the construction. The stonework was solid, but not professional, clearly the work of determined amateurs. Chunks of limestone, river rock, and fragments of brick were mortared together with careful precision. And wedged between the stones, he could see other things. Small metal objects that might have been military medals, coins, what looked like a child's toy soldier. Each family had brought something, Martha had said, a piece of their history. Ethan circled the statue, taking photos from every angle, noting the hairline crack that ran along the base's eastern face. Through his camera lens, he studied the marble face, looking for flaws in the carving that might explain the townspeople's emotional attachment. What he saw instead was artistry that belonged in a cathedral. Carlo Mancini had been a master at his craft. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ethan began to understand why this place commanded such devotion. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills stretching to the edge of sight, the town spread out below like a child's train set, the distant gleam of the Ohio River threading through farmland. From here, you could see everything, every house, every street, every soul in St. Mary's Creek. A guardian's view. He was setting up his equipment for some time-lapse photography when he heard footsteps on the path. A woman emerged from the tree line carrying a bundle of white lilies. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, wearing a navy coat despite the warm evening. "You must be the reporter," she said, approaching without hesitation. "I'm Ruth Kelly. Ethan Cole, I hope I'm not intruding. This hill belongs to everyone. Ruth knelt at the statue's base and began arranging the lilies in a mason jar filled with water. I bring flowers every Friday, have for 30 years. Why Friday? It's the day my husband died. Ruth's hands were steady as she worked. Car accident on Route 9. They said he never felt anything, but I needed to feel like I was still caring for him somehow. She looked up at the statue's face. She understands that kind of love. Ethan watched Ruth work, noting the practiced efficiency of her movements, the way she spoke to the marble figure as if it could hear her. Do you really believe she's aware? Ruth sat back on her heels, considering the question. You want to know if I think there's some kind of spirit in the stone? If she can actually see and hear and care about our little problems? She shrugged. I don't know. But I know that when I climb this hill with my grief, I leave feeling lighter. When I tell her about my grandchildren, the words come easier. When I'm scared about the future, standing here makes me feel like someone's listening. That could just be psychological. Could be, Ruth agreed. But what if it's not? What if some places really are thin spots between this world and something larger? What if some promises really do echo in eternity? She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Besides, does it matter if it's real in the way you want it to be real? The love is real. The hope is real. The peace people find here is real. Sometimes that's enough. Ruth walked to the edge of the summit and looked out over the valley. When the developers came with their plans to move her, they kept talking about accessibility, visibility, convenience, making her more available to tourists. She turned back to Ethan, but they missed the point entirely, which is, she's not a tourist attraction. She's not even really a statue. Ruth's voice grew quiet. She's a promise kept, and some promises are too sacred to be convenient. As Ruth disappeared down the path, Ethan found himself alone with the statue as darkness fell. He'd intended to set up camp with his equipment, document any unusual phenomena, capture whatever optical illusions or natural events might explain the townspeople's experiences. Instead, he found himself simply sitting in the grass, his back against a maple tree, watching the marble figure emerge from shadow into moonlight. The silence was profound, not empty, but full. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, your own small place in the vast machinery of existence. Below, lights flickered on in St. Mary's Creek like earthbound stars. Above, the real stars emerged one by one in the clear Kentucky sky. At some point, he couldn't say when, Ethan became aware that he was no longer alone. Nothing dramatic, no chills or sudden appearances. Just a gradual sense that someone else was there, sharing the hilltop. He turned, expecting to see another late-night visitor, but found only emptiness. The feeling persisted, a presence that was patient, gentle, watchful, like being observed by someone who wished him well. Ethan had spent years training himself to notice the subtle cues that gave away hoaxes and illusions. The nearly imperceptible sounds of hidden speakers, the faint chemical smells of phosphorescent paint, the tiny movements that revealed concealed mechanisms. Here, he detected none of those things. Just the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, and the peculiar sensation that he was being quietly, lovingly supervised. At 3:33 a.m., he heard it. The bell. 3 slow, deep tolls that seemed to roll down from the sky itself. The sound was impossibly rich and resonant, like bronze struck by a master bell ringer. It hung in the air for long seconds after each toll, fading gradually into the night. Ethan scrambled for his recording equipment, but by the time he had it activated, the silence had returned. He played back the last 5 minutes of ambient recording. Nothing but wind and distant traffic on the highway. But he had heard it, as clearly as he'd ever heard anything in his life. He packed up his equipment as dawn approached, hiking down the hill with more questions than answers. In his motel room, he reviewed the night's photos and recordings. Everything was normal. Exactly what you'd expect from a nighttime vigil at a rural statue. Everything except the feeling that he'd been in the presence of something profound. That morning, Ethan called his editor in Louisville. Find anything interesting? Marcus asked. Still investigating, Ethan replied, which was true. Need a few more days. Getting the local color? Good. Remember, we want the human interest angle before you pull back the curtain. After hanging up, Ethan stared at his laptop screen, cursor blinking in an empty document. For the first time in his career, he had no idea what story he was going to write. The opposition to moving the statue hadn't organized itself overnight. It had grown like a root system, spreading through family connections, shared memories, and the peculiar intimacy of small-town life. By the time the developers made their intentions public, they were facing something more complex than simple resistance to change. They were facing an entire community's relationship with the sacred. Ethan learned this during his third day in town, when he attended what the local paper had advertised as a public information meeting about the saint, Mary's spiritual retreat and resort project. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate the crowd. He arrived early and chose a seat in the bleachers where he could observe both the presenters and the audience. The developers had brought the full multimedia experience: a projection screen, glossy brochures, and an architectural model that transformed Rosary Hill into something that looked like a cross between a theme park and a monastery. Ladies and gentlemen, began Richard Volkov, the project's lead developer. He was a lean man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from closing deals in boardrooms. What we're proposing isn't change for change's sake. It's a celebration of what makes your community special, made accessible to visitors from across the region. The presentation was slick and professional. Computer-generated images showed the proposed resort: a glass visitor center at the summit, paved walkways lined with ornamental trees, guided tours departing every hour, gift shops, a cafe, parking for 300 vehicles. And there, relocated to a place of honor near the main entrance, stood the statue of Our Lady, floodlit and surrounded by manicured gardens. The relocation of the existing statue, Volkov explained, will actually increase its visibility and accessibility while protecting it from weather damage. Our team includes specialists in historic preservation who... Where? The voice came from the middle of the crowd, cutting through the presentation like a blade. Volkov paused, squinting into the lights. I'm sorry? Where are you planning to move her? The speaker stood up. Ruth Kelly, wearing the same navy coat she'd worn to the hill. Show us exactly where. Volkov clicked to the next slide, a detailed site plan. A red arrow pointed to a spot near the parking area, perhaps 200 yards from the statue's current location. Here, adjacent to the Welcome Plaza. Visitors will see it immediately upon arrival. A murmur ran through the crowd, not quite disapproval, but something deeper. Unease. That's not the same place, said an elderly man in the front row. Ethan recognized him as Frank Dwyer from the auto shop. Well, no, Volkov admitted. The current location is needed for the access road, and then it's not the same. This from a woman in her 30s whom Ethan didn't recognize. It's not where she chose to be. Ma'am, with respect, statues don't choose locations. They're placed by who? Ruth Kelly was still standing, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. By the people who made a promise, and that promise was to keep her right where she is. Volkov's professional composure flickered. I understand there are emotional attachments, but we're talking about a significant economic opportunity for your community. Jobs, tax revenue, regional recognition. At what cost? This from Pastor Jim Brennan, who'd been silent until now. The priest was younger than Ethan had expected, perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes. Some things can't be measured in dollars, Mr. Volkov. Of course not, Father, but this project would actually enhance the spiritual significance of the site. Imagine thousands of people coming here, finding the same peace and inspiration that your parishioners have. Thousands of people taking selfies and buying t-shirts. Martha Grady's voice was thin, but carried surprising strength. She'd been wheeled to the front row by her niece, wrapped in blankets despite the warm evening. You want to turn sacred ground into a shopping mall? The crowd's murmur grew louder. Ethan could feel the tension building, not explosive, but implacable, like water wearing a waystone. Mrs. Grady, Volkov said, consulting his notes, I understand you've lived here your entire life. You must remember when this town was more prosperous, when young people didn't have to leave to find opportunity. This project could bring that vitality back. Child, Martha's voice cut through the noise like a blade. I was here when she was raised. I helped lay the stones of her foundation. I know what promise was made, and I know what promise was written. Moving her breaks that promise, and broken promises. She paused, her pale eyes finding Volkov's across the crowded gym. Broken promises don't bring prosperity. They bring judgment. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Even those who supported the project seemed unsettled by the old woman's certainty. Dr. Patricia Wells, the town's only physician and a member of the city council, stood up. Martha, we all respect the statue's history, but we also have to think about the town's future. Half our young people leave for college and never come back. The farms are struggling. Main Street is dying. If we don't take opportunities like this, then we die with dignity intact. This from a young man Ethan didn't recognize. Some things are worth more than money. Easy to say when you don't have children to feed, Dr. Wells replied sharply. Or elderly parents who need medical care we can't provide because our tax base has dried up. The meeting continued for another hour, but the real battle lines had been drawn in those first few exchanges. On one side, practical people who saw a chance to revitalize a dying town. On the other, those who believed some things were too sacred to compromise. What surprised Ethan was how many people seemed genuinely torn. These weren't ideological divisions, but personal ones, splitting families and friendships along fault lines of faith, economics, and competing visions of what St. Mary's Creek should become. After the meeting ended, Ethan lingered in the parking lot, watching small groups form and dissolve in intense conversation. The supporters of the project spoke in terms of opportunity, growth, and practical necessity. The opponents used words like desecration, betrayal, and consequence. Quite a show, wasn't it? Ethan turned to find a man about his own age extending his hand. David Torres, town librarian? You're the journalist from Louisville? Ethan Cole. Yes, I'm covering the story. David was slight and bookish, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I've been following your work at the Courier-Ledger. Your piece on the Greenwood haunting was particularly thorough. You read my debunking articles? I read everything. Part of the job. David gestured toward the dispersing crowd. So what do you think? Mass hysteria? Economic anxiety manifesting as religious fervor? There was something in David's tone that made Ethan cautious. What do you think? I think, David said carefully, that some stories resist simple explanations. I've lived here my whole life, Mr. Cole. I've seen what that statue means to people. I've also seen what happens when sacred things are treated carelessly. Such as, David looked toward Rosary Hill, where the statue stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. 3 years ago, a college kid from Louisville, maybe a friend of yours, came here to spray paint gang tags on the base. Thought it would be funny to vandalize the Hillbilly Shrine. What happened? He slipped on the first step up to the statue, broke his leg in 3 places, said later he felt like someone had pushed him, but he was alone on the hill. David's voice was matter of fact. Could have been coincidence, bad footing. But the interesting thing is what happened next, which was he came back after his leg healed, climbed the hill again, this time with a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush. Spent 2 hours cleaning off the paint he'd sprayed, then sat at the base for another hour just sitting. Never said what changed his mind. Ethan made a note, though he wasn't sure why. The point is, David continued, that statue has been watching over this town for 70 years, through good times and bad, war and peace, birth and death. People have brought their deepest hopes and fears to that hill. You can't just relocate that kind of history, but surely you can understand the economic argument. Of course I can. I'm not an idiot, Mr. Cole. I know what it's like to watch a town die slowly, year by year. I know what it means when the best and brightest leave and never come back. David's voice grew sad. But I also know what it means to have something in your life that's unchanging. Something you can count on when everything else is falling apart. A car horn honked softly. David waved toward a woman waiting in a sedan. That's my wife. She thinks I talk too much to strangers." He turned back to Ethan. "But I'll tell you one more thing. The developers are planning to make their move next week. Bring in the heavy equipment, get it done quickly before opposition can organize. They think they're dealing with sentimental locals who'll grumble and give in. And they're wrong." David smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. Cole, that statue has stood through 70 years of storms. Ice storms, tornadoes, lightning strikes that left trees shattered all around her. Never so much as a chip in the marble. You think she's going to move now just because some men with machines want her to?" As David walked away, Ethan found himself looking up at Rosary Hill again. From this distance, the statue was little more than a pale gleam in the darkness. But even from here, he could feel its presence. Solid, patient, immovable. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor. "How's the debunking coming? Need story by Friday." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Still gathering facts. Story more complex than expected. Don't get too deep in the weeds. Remember, rational explanation, local color, clean conclusion, that's what sells." Ethan put his phone away without responding. As he drove back to the motel, he realized he was no longer sure what kind of story he was supposed to be telling. The first attempt to move the statue was scheduled for the following Monday. Ethan learned about it not from any official announcement, but from the rumor mill that powered all small-town communication. Carla mentioned it while refilling his coffee at Tony's diner. Frank Dwyer confirmed it at the gas station. By Sunday evening, everyone in St. Mary's Creek knew what was coming. Ethan arrived at Rosary Hill just after dawn, expecting to find angry protesters or at least some organized resistance. Instead, he found something more unsettling: silent witnesses. Perhaps 40 people stood at the base of the hill, arranged in loose clusters around the access road. No signs, no chants, no angry confrontations with the workers who were unloading equipment from flatbed trucks. They simply stood and watched, their faces grave, as if attending a funeral. The machinery was impressive. 2 cranes, one the size of a 3-story building, along with hydraulic lifts, steel cables thick as a man's wrist, and a reinforced flatbed trailer designed for heavy transport. The crew moved with professional efficiency, men who'd relocated monuments and architectural features across the southeast. Ethan positioned himself where he could observe both the workers and the townspeople. His rational mind catalogued the straightforward engineering challenge. Lift a 2-ton marble statue, secure it to the transport platform, and move it 200 yards to its new location. Nothing the equipment couldn't handle easily. But as the morning progressed, he began to notice details that didn't fit the narrative of routine relocation. The first sign was subtle. As the crew hauled cables up the hill, several workers kept glancing over their shoulders, as if they felt watched. The foreman, a gruff man named Bill Hutchins, barked orders with increasing irritation, telling his men to focus on the job and stop acting like tourists. By 8:30, the steel cables were secured around the statue's base, and the main crane was in position. Hutchins radioed the operator. "Okay, let's see what she weighs." The crane's engine roared to life. The cables tightened, drawing straight and taut. Hydraulic pressure built with a steady whine. The statue didn't budge. Hutchins frowned, signaling the operator to ease back and try again. This time, the strain gauge on the crane climbed past what should have been more than sufficient to lift 2 tons of marble. The steel cables groaned under tension. Still, nothing moved. "What the hell?" Hutchins muttered, then louder. "Cut power!" The engine died. The cables went slack. In the sudden silence, Ethan heard something that made his skin crawl. A low, resonant sound like wind through a cavern, though the air was perfectly still. Several of the townspeople had heard it too. Ruth Kelly crossed herself. Martha Grady, seated in a folding chair brought by her niece, nodded as if confirming something she'd expected. "Check the rigging," Hutchins ordered. "Something's not right." For the next hour, the crew examined every connection, every cable, every anchor point. The setup was textbook perfect. The crane had lifted heavier loads than this without breaking a sweat. There was no mechanical reason for the failure. They tried again at 10:15. This time, as the cables reached maximum tension, one of them snapped with a sound like a gunshot. 20 feet of braided steel whipped through the air, missing a worker's head by inches before embedding itself in the dirt. The man stumbled backward, pale and shaking. "That's a brand new cable," he said to nobody in particular. "Rated for 5 tons?" The crowd of townspeople hadn't moved, but Ethan could feel their tension like electricity before a storm. Some prayed quietly, lips moving in rhythm with rosary beads. Others simply stared at the statue, as if willing it to remain where it stood. Hutchins called for a break while they brought in replacement cables. The workers retreated to their trucks, clustering in small groups and speaking in low voices. Even from a distance, Ethan could see they were rattled. He approached one of them, a crane operator named Gus, who was drinking coffee from a thermos with shaking hands. "Tough morning," Ethan said. Gus looked at him suspiciously. "You a reporter?" "Yeah, Louisville Courier-Ledger. Mind if I ask what you think happened up there?" "Equipment failure. Happens all the time." But Gus's voice lacked conviction. "Ever have a cable snap on a routine lift?" "Once or twice. Metal fatigue, manufacturing defect." Gus took a sip of coffee, then looked toward the hilltop where the statue stood unmoved. "But I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never felt anything like..." "Like what?" Gus was quiet for a long moment. "Like something was pushing back," he said finally. "When that cable snapped, it wasn't like mechanical failure. It was like something just said no." The second attempt began at noon with heavier cables and a more powerful winch truck to assist the crane. This time, they managed to lift the statue perhaps an inch before the winch truck's engine seized with a grinding scream of tortured metal. Black smoke poured from under the hood, and the acrid smell of burned oil filled the air. $40,000 engine, Hutchins said, staring at the steaming truck. "Serviced last week." The third attempt never got started. As the crew was rigging the new cables, a sudden wind swept across the hilltop, not the gentle breeze that had been blowing all morning, but a sharp, cold gust that sent hard hats tumbling and knocked over equipment. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, so abruptly that Ethan could see his breath. One of the workers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, stopped in the middle of securing a cable and looked up at the statue's face. He stood that way for perhaps 30 seconds, then quietly unclipped his safety harness and walked down the hill. He didn't speak to his foreman, didn't explain himself, just got in his truck and drove away. 2 more men followed within the hour. By late afternoon, Hutchins made the call that everyone had been expecting. "Pack it up," he told his remaining crew. "We'll try again tomorrow with fresh equipment." But even as they loaded the machinery onto trucks, Ethan could see that something had changed. The professional confidence was gone, replaced by the kind of wariness that comes from encountering something beyond normal experience. That evening, Ethan found himself back on Rosary Hill, drawn by questions he couldn't articulate. The statue stood exactly as it had that morning, arms outstretched, marble face serene. But the hilltop felt different somehow, charged, expectant, as if the day's events had awakened something that had been sleeping. He wasn't alone. As darkness fell, people began arriving. Not protesters or organized demonstrators, but individuals and families climbing the path with candles, flowers, and quiet prayers. They arranged themselves in a loose circle around the statue, lighting their candles against the October wind. Ruth Kelly was there with her weekly lilies. Pastor Brennan knelt in prayer at the statue's base. David Torres from the library sat reading aloud from what looked like a book of Psalms. Martha Grady had been brought up in a wheelchair, bundled in blankets, her ancient eyes fixed on the marble face as if reading secrets written there. As the circle of candlelight grew, Ethan found himself thinking about everything he'd witnessed that day. Equipment failures, yes. Coincidences, possibly. But there had been something else. Something his rational mind couldn't classify or dismiss. The feeling that the statue was aware, that it was choosing to stay. At 11:47 p.m., the bell tolled. 3 deep, resonant notes that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound was impossibly rich and full, like bronze cast by master craftsmen and struck by someone who understood the music hidden in metal. It hung in the air long after the last note faded, washing over the assembled crowd like a benediction. This time, Ethan's recorder was running. This time, he was ready. But when he played back the digital file later, all he heard was wind through trees and the distant murmur of prayers. The bell, which everyone present had heard clearly, existed nowhere in the electronic record. "Some things," Ruth Kelly said softly, approaching him as the crowd began to disperse, "aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be experienced." She walked past him down the path, leaving Ethan alone with the statue and a growing certainty that his story was not going to be the rational debunking his editor expected. The second day brought bigger machines and harder men. Ethan arrived at Rosary Hill before sunrise to find the access road clogged with equipment that dwarfed Monday's machinery. A crane the size of a city building dominated the landscape, its boom reaching toward the stars like a mechanical prayer. Floodlights turned the hillside into an alien landscape of harsh shadows and glaring illumination. The new crew was different too. These weren't local contractors, but specialists flown in from Nashville and Chicago. Men who'd moved lighthouses, relocated historical buildings, transported massive sculptures for museums and monuments. They worked with the grim efficiency of professionals who'd encountered every possible complication. Bill Hutchins had been replaced by a hard-faced foreman named Ray Kowalski, whose reputation included moving a 12-ton bronze statue from the steps of the Detroit City Hall to a new location 3 miles away. If anyone could relocate a stubborn piece of marble, it was Kowalski. The crowd of townspeople was larger this morning, nearly 60 souls standing in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the October chill. They'd organized themselves into shifts, ensuring that witnesses would be present throughout the day. Some carried thermoses of coffee, others clutched rosaries or prayer books. All watched the hilltop with the intensity of people waiting for a verdict. Ethan positioned himself halfway up the slope, close enough to observe the work, but far enough to avoid the inevitable confrontation between faith and engineering. His rational mind still expected the statue to yield to superior equipment and expertise. But a growing part of him, the part that had heard bells toll from empty air, wondered if faith might prove stronger than hydraulic pressure. "Big day," someone said behind him. Ethan turned to find Tyler Grant, the architecture student who'd been part of the original survey team. The young man looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept well in weeks. "I heard you asked to be reassigned," Ethan said. Tyler nodded, his eyes fixed on the statue. "Bad dreams. Every night since I measured that base. Dreams of her falling, but not breaking. Just falling forward onto everything I'd drawn, crushing the blueprints to dust. Dreams are just—" "I know what dreams are," Tyler interrupted. "I'm a rational person, Mr. Cole. Engineering student, member of the American Humanist Association, voted for every pro-science candidate on the ballot. I don't believe in ghosts or miracles or statues that think for themselves." He paused, pulling his jacket tighter against the morning chill. "But I also know what I feel when I get within 50 feet of that thing. Like someone's watching me, someone who knows exactly what I'm thinking and doesn't approve." Tyler's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone who's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For me to make the wrong choice." Before Ethan could respond, Kowalski's voice crackled over a bullhorn. "Clear the work area! We're beginning operations." The new approach was methodical and overwhelming. Instead of trying to lift the statue directly, Kowalski's team planned to excavate around the foundation, undermining it until the entire structure could be shifted intact. It was the technique they'd used on the Detroit statue, and it had worked flawlessly. The backhoe started first, its bucket biting into the earth beside the statue's base. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded normally. Dirt flew, the foundation began to emerge, and Ethan allowed himself to think that superior planning had overcome whatever psychological factors had affected Monday's crew. Then the operator hit something. Not a rock or a utility line, but something that made the massive machine shudder and recoil as if it had struck something alive. The hydraulic arm jerked backwards so violently that the operator was thrown against his safety harness. "What the hell was that?" Kowalski demanded, striding toward the machine. The operator, a grizzled man in his 50s named Pete, climbed down from the cab, his face pale. "Felt like the bucket got grabbed," he said, "like something reached up and yanked it back." Kowalski examined the excavation site. The bucket had penetrated perhaps 2 feet into the soil before stopping. Not hitting bedrock or obstacles, just stopping as if the earth itself had refused to yield. "Try again," Kowalski ordered. Different angle. Pete remounted the backhoe and repositioned the arm. This time, the bucket penetrated barely 6 inches before the machine's hydraulic system failed completely. Oil sprayed from ruptured lines, pooling in the dirt like mechanical blood. "That's a brand new hydraulic system," Pete said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Installed last month. There's no reason for that kind of failure." Among the watching townspeople, Ethan noticed a subtle shift. Backs straightened, eyes brightened, and more than a few hands made the sign of the cross. Martha Grady, bundled in her wheelchair at the front of the crowd, nodded slowly, as if confirming an expectation. Kowalski wasn't ready to concede. He called for the backup excavator, a smaller but more maneuverable machine designed for precision work. If they couldn't attack the foundation directly, they'd work around it, undermining the soil until the statue's weight did the work for them. The second machine lasted exactly 11 minutes before its engine seized with a grinding shriek that sounded almost organic, like a dying animal rather than failing machinery. The operator shut down immediately and climbed out, his hands shaking as he reached for his cell phone to call his supervisor. "I'm not operating that machine again," he told Kowalski flatly. "Not here, not around that thing. It's a piece of marble," Kowalski snapped. "Stone doesn't cause engine failure." "Stone doesn't do a lot of things," the operator replied. "But I know what I felt in that cab. Something was fighting me. Every time I tried to dig, it was like the ground was pushing back." 2 more workers quietly packed up their tools and left without explanation. Kowalski made the decision to abandon excavation and return to direct lifting. He ordered the massive crane into position, its boom extending over the statue like a mechanical thundercloud. If brute force couldn't move the foundation, perhaps precise application of overwhelming power could lift the statue clear. The new cables were rated for 15 tons, more than 7 times the statue's estimated weight. The connections were checked and double-checked by engineers who'd moved structures far larger and more complex than a small marble figure. At 2:30 p.m., Kowalski gave the signal. The crane's engine roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. The boom extended to its full reach, positioning the main cable directly over the statue's center of gravity. Hydraulic systems engaged with mechanical precision. The cable tightened. For a moment, just a moment, Ethan thought it was going to work. The statue seemed to shift slightly, rising perhaps an inch from its foundation. The crowd of townspeople held its collective breath. Then the weather changed, not gradually, not with the normal pattern of approaching storms, but instantly and absolutely. The clear October sky darkened, as if someone had dimmed the lights. Wind that had been calm and gentle became a howling gale that sent hard hats tumbling and knocked smaller men off their feet. The temperature plummeted. Ethan's breath came out in puffs of white vapor, and frost began forming on the crane's metal surfaces. It was as if winter had arrived in the space of heartbeats, bringing with it a cold that seemed to penetrate not just clothing, but bone. One of the crew members, a young rigger named Danny, suddenly stopped what he was doing and stared up at the statue's face. His expression changed from professional concentration to something approaching terror. "She's looking at me," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "She's looking right at me." Kowalski followed the man's gaze. The statue's marble face was unchanged, eyes downcast, expression serene. But there was something in the quality of light, the way shadows fell across the carved features, that made it seem aware. "Get back to work," Kowalski ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. The crane operator, a veteran named Hal, who'd lifted everything from bridge spans to space shuttle components, tried to resume the lift. The engine strained, the boom shuddered, and every gauge on his control panel began flashing warning lights. Then came the lightning, not the building electrical charge of a normal storm, but a single bolt that split the grey sky like a sword of white fire. It struck the ground less than 10 feet from the statue's base with a sound that wasn't just heard, but felt. A concussion that knocked several workers flat and left everyone's ears ringing. The air filled with the sharp ozone smell of electrical discharge and something else. Something that reminded Ethan of incense and old stones and promises written in permanent ink. In the sudden silence that followed, the crane's engine died. Not shut down, not turned off, but dead, as if every electrical system had simply decided to stop functioning. Hal frantically worked his controls, but the massive machine sat as motionless as the statue it had been trying to move. "That's it," Kowalski announced, his professional composure finally cracking. "Pack it up. We're done here." "What about tomorrow?" one of his remaining crew asked. Kowalski looked up at the statue, which stood exactly as it had that morning, unmarked, unmoved, marble-faced serene despite the technological warfare that had raged around it. "There is no tomorrow," he said. "Not for this job." As the machinery was loaded onto trucks and the crew prepared to leave, Ethan found himself thinking about Tyler Grant's words from that morning. Someone who's waiting. Now he understood what the young architect had meant. The statue wasn't just refusing to be moved. It was demonstrating, with quiet and implacable authority, that some things in the world were not subject to human will or mechanical force. Some promises, once made, could not be broken. That evening, as candles once again flickered around the statue's base, Ethan sat in his motel room staring at a blank computer screen. His editor had called twice, demanding the story. The deadline was tomorrow, but for the first time in his career as a professional skeptic, Ethan had no rational explanation to offer. Only the growing certainty that he'd witnessed something that couldn't be explained away with talk of coincidence and equipment failure. He'd witnessed faith made manifest, and it was more powerful than anything he'd ever imagined. The phone rang at 6:17 a.m. Ethan's editor Marcus crackled through the ancient landline with barely contained impatience. "Ethan, I need that story. Today. The presses run at noon." Ethan sat up, seeing Rosary Hill silhouetted against dawn through his window. "Marcus, I need more time. This story is complicated." "Complicated how?" "Small town clings to folklore. Equipment fails for mundane reasons." "Write it up." "It's not that simple." "You're not going native on me, are you? Please tell me you haven't bought into whatever supernatural nonsense these people are selling." Ethan looked at his notebook filled with observations that defied categorization. Multiple equipment failures under perfect conditions. Atmospheric phenomena that... Equipment fails, weather changes. Your job is to find the real explanation, not get caught up in local mythology. What if the local mythology is the real explanation? Long silence. "Ethan, you've built your reputation debunking this nonsense. Don't throw away your credibility for some feel-good story about miraculous statues. My credibility is built on telling the truth. It's built on rational journalism. That's what pays your salary." After hanging up, David Torres knocked with coffee and historical documents. Newspaper clippings from 1949, church records, photographs of townspeople gathered around the newly erected statue, their faces radiant with something deeper than satisfaction. "Look at their eyes," David said softly. "These are people who've witnessed something sacred." A Weather Service report detailed the 1949 storm that nearly destroyed St. Mary's Creek, a massive system that inexplicably shifted course at the last moment. Meteorological anomaly, it concluded. No atmospheric pressure differential to account for sudden directional change. "Even the Weather Service couldn't explain it," David said. "But the townspeople didn't need explanations. They had faith." "You're suggesting faith changes physical reality?" "Some mysteries are bigger than our ability to explain them. That doesn't make them less real." David left him with advice. Write the truth. All of it. Not just parts that fit conventional thinking. Ethan began writing. Not the debunking piece his editor expected, but an honest account of everything he'd witnessed. Equipment failures defying mechanical explanation. Weather changes violating physics. Rational people describing impossible experiences. He wrote about Martha Grady's certainty, Ruth Kelly's faith, his own transformation from skeptical observer to reluctant witness. The story ran 4,000 words. Honest, thorough, and unpublishable by rational journalism standards. It was also the best thing he'd ever written. Marcus called 20 minutes after Ethan sent it. "What the hell is this? This reads like a conversion narrative, not journalism. It's what I witnessed. It's unpublishable. 4,000 words about a miraculous statue? Our readers want facts, not fairy tales." These are facts. These are delusions. This isn't the story we assigned. Maybe the story I was hired to write doesn't exist. Then make it exist. Find the rational explanation. Ethan looked at the statue on Rosary Hill. Number, I won't write a story I don't believe. I won't ignore evidence because it doesn't fit our editorial preferences. Your reputation, your career, it's built on rational skepticism. Are you really willing to throw that away? Ethan thought about machinery failing for no reason, bells tolling from empty air, the certainty in Martha Grady's ancient eyes. Yes, he said, I am. After Marcus hung up, promising to run a properly factual account by someone else, Ethan packed slowly. He had one more decision to make about who he wanted to be when this was all over. The third attempt came at dawn without warning. Ethan learned from Carla at the diner. Military contractors with massive equipment were already swarming Rosary Hill like an invasion force. 3 industrial cranes dominated the landscape, their booms reaching skyward like mechanical giants. Floodlights turned pre-dawn into harsh noon. The statue stood serene at the center of the chaos, arms outstretched, unmoved. Nearly 100 townspeople had gathered below. Ruth Kelly with her lilies, Pastor Brennan clutching his Bible, Martha Grady alert in her wheelchair. They watched in grim silence as their sacred ground was prepared for assault. Colonel Harrison, the retired military contractor leading the operation, established a perimeter and announced through a bullhorn, "This is a restricted work zone. Please remain behind the designated area." No one moved. The townspeople stood like peaceful soldiers, watching their hilltop being prepared for desecration. Harrison's strategy was overwhelming force. Destabilize the foundation until the structure collapsed into a prepared cradle. 3 hydraulic excavators attacked from different angles. For an hour, everything proceeded normally. Then the diggers hit the foundation stones donated by each family in 1949. The first machine recoiled as if slapped. Rodriguez, the operator, tried again. His bucket penetrated 6 inches before the hydraulic system locked completely. The second excavator's engine began smoking with the sharp smell of incense mixed with ozone. "Something's wrong with the air up here," the operator told Harrison, his face pale. "Feels like breathing static electricity." By 8 a.m., 4 pieces of heavy equipment sat silent and useless. Martha Grady nodded with grim satisfaction as more townspeople crossed themselves. Harrison ordered the main crane into position. Cables rated for 60 tons, 30 times the statue's weight, were secured with military precision. At 9:15 a.m., he gave the signal. The crane roared to life. 60 tons of lifting force focused on 2 tons of marble. For a heartbeat, the statue seemed to yield, rising half an inch with a grinding sound like a groan of pain. Then the world changed. A tremor thrummed through the air itself. Not heard, but felt, like the heartbeat of something vast. Electronics malfunctioned. The sky darkened as if drinking light. Temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly, frost forming on metal surfaces. Wind struck like an invisible fist, knocking workers flat and sending equipment flying. But the statue stood utterly still, wrapped in perfect calm, while chaos raged around it. Through his camera lens, Ethan saw the impossible. The statue was resisting, growing heavier with each inch, drawing strength from forces beyond engineering. Then came 3 lightning bolts in perfect succession, white, blue, silver, striking the ground in a triangle around the statue. The concussion knocked everyone flat, ears ringing. In the deafening silence, every engine died. Not shut down, dead, as if every electrical system had simply refused to function. Harrison stood among millions of dollars in useless machinery, his military bearing finally shaken. "Sir?" a subordinate asked. "Orders?" Harrison looked at the statue, which had settled gently back onto its foundation. "Pack it up," he said quietly. "We're done here." "Should we call for more equipment?" "Soldier, I've moved mountains in my time, but I've never encountered anything like this. Whatever's holding that statue is beyond my pay grade." The townspeople hadn't celebrated. Only quiet nods and more candles at the statue's feet. They'd witnessed not victory, but confirmation that some things remained beyond human manipulation. That evening, Ethan's phone rang. His editor Marcus demanded something rational to print about the industrial accident. "I have the truth," Ethan said finally. "Some promises are stronger than steel cables." Some places are too sacred to be moved. Faith, when real enough, can change the laws of physics. Ethan, Marcus said after a long silence, you're fired. Ethan felt relief. He was free to tell the truth without editorial constraints, free to write about mystery without solving it. He opened a new document. There are places in this world where the extraordinary still happens. Pins, 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 pins.